Today we're going to do some watercolor techniques, which just means the way that you're using your watercolors. We're going to start with Crayon Resist. So I'm going to draw with some crayon, and you can explore different colors, different designs and lines and see what happens. Then I'm going to get my brush wet, and I'm going to choose a color that's different or darker than the crayon that I've used. So I'm going to use some purple. And when I paint over, the crayon will show up underneath. Anytime you're using watercolor, if you're changing colors, make sure you're washing your brush before you go to a next color. That's why this yellow is not a bright yellow, because the brush was not clean. It's also good to have a paper towel, that way you can dry your brush off if it gets a little bit too wet. The next thing we're going to try is wet on wet, and this just means that you're going to have wet paint on your paper, and you're going to add colors while the other colors are still wet, and they will start to mix together. So if you're doing this technique, you might want to think about what colors will look best when they mix. For this one, the paint is already dry, so I can add designs on top and the colors will not mix. This is a great way to add layers, add designs, add texture. For blotting, you're going to want to have a Kleenex, a paper towel handy, and we are going to add color. I love this technique for making clouds, so I'm going to use blue. And then you're going to take your paper towel, Kleenex, whatever you're using, and it might help to move it around so you have a clean spot. So blotting just means taking some of that color off. For this next one, it helps if your paint is wet. And you're going to use, you can use the handle of your brush, anything that's going to be a little bit sharper, and you're going to drag it through the paint, and it will actually make lines in your colors. Now mine did not work that well because I used a lot of paint. So sometimes you can even just get your paper wet first, use your handle, and then if you add a small amount of color, the color will soak into where you scratched. So this is a great way to do small details and to add textures. And for this next one, we're going to use salt. And when we do the salt technique, it really helps if your paint is quite wet. So get your colors on there and then be ready to sprinkle your salt quickly. And we just take a little pinch and sprinkle it onto the wet paint. So again, small pinch, that way we're not covering our paper with salt, just that one area. And we're gonna let that dry. And when it's dry, you will actually rub the salt off into the trash can. While the salt is on there, you can also add little dots of other color, and you'll see that the paint will soak up around that salt. For rubbing alcohol is just the kind you use if you have a cut. I poured a little bit in a dish, so I'm going to put some color on my paper. And then I'm just going to put some rubbing alcohol on my brush, and I drop that onto the paint, and look what happens. It makes these really cool dots in your paint. For stippling and dotting, I'm going to use a Q-tip. You could also use the eraser of a pencil. You could use a small paintbrush, but I like this because it makes nice uniform dots. Uniform meaning all about the same size. And we're gonna get that wet, dot it in the paint. You can try mixing your colors. You may have to use more than one Q-tip. Leave spaces between them if you don't want the colors to mix. Masking is when we cover up an area. You can use a piece of paper that you've cut or torn yourself. You can also use painter's tape or masking tape. It's better if you do not use clear tape. Clear tape tends to rip the paper when you take it off. So for masking, I'm going to get my brush wet, and you don't want to use too much paint when you're doing masking. It just does not work as well, especially if you're cutting out your paper. So I'm going to hold it, paint, And then I'm going to very carefully peel this off, and it leaves a space where my paper was. And with the tape, it's best if we leave that on there until the paint's dry. That way we don't rip the paper when we pull the tape off. Outlining first just means drawing first. You can use pencil, you can use a ballpoint pen, you could use something that is even more waterproof, like a thin Sharpie or even a thick Sharpie, depending on how bold and dark you want your outline to be. This helps if you're really trying to plan ahead and do details. And when I'm filling in like this, it's better to use a smaller brush. That way we can stay within our lines. If you use a water washable marker like Crayola markers and you do this, it will smear everywhere. So make sure that if you're outlining first, you are really thinking about what material you're using to outline with. And the last one is outlining later. So I painted this before we started. Now when it's dry, I can outline around it. The nice thing about waiting to outline until later is you can really clean up edges if you want things to look smoother. You can also make some interesting designs based on what you've painted. So if I have blobs like this, I can turn it into something. And then again, if you're using a small paintbrush, you can even outline with paint, any color you want. Now that it's dry, my outline will show up better. And I'm going to try peeling this tape off. I probably should let this dry a little bit more, but let's see what happens. So you can see it, the paint kind of creeped underneath the tape a little bit. I would want to make sure that the next time I mask, that I really smooth that down with my finger to keep the paint from going underneath that tape. Also notice that my wet on wet really mixed together. If I was going to do wet on wet, I would want to use a little bit less paint this time. Wash my brush to change colors and just small dots of color. That way the colors mix in an interesting way.